I will take POIs both verbally and on chat. My speech will start in three, two, one. Government says that they're going to select different kinds of tiers in the ways in which they can intervene, how this is well, not going to be like a full-on military intervention, but they're going to start off with things like sanctions and warnings and then likely going to like pile it up as they go. First of all, we think that this is not going to be very different or nor helpful from what they're currently doing in the status quo, meaning that like given that what we're doing in the status quo, such as being a little bit more passive or just letting ECOWAS do their own thing is not working, the comparative metric in which AU is actually able to bring the impacts that you guys are claiming is when they're able to actually defend something that is more intervening, such as actually sending military troops. So if government wants to take the impact that they are claiming, they need to also claim the fact that these interventions are likely going to be a lot more severe than such as like doing things like sanctions. Also, secondly, things like sanctions are not going to be very helpful because, like you said, these coup d'etats are largely organized by the military. These largely happen in like very, very politically and economically unstable regions where a lot of trade doesn't even happen in the first place. So the kind of impetus or the kind of things that you're cutting off itself, like there's nothing really to cut off in the first place. So the impact that you are able to give through things like sanctions is very, very little. That is why military intervention is probably the likely scenario in our case. Now let's move on to secondly, they talked about how foreign powers like US, China, France are not going to likely intervene in these scenarios. We tell you that even if that's true, even if your characterizations are true, the sum is not net zero. So it's not like the US allocates absolutely zero budget to put to Africa because they're occupied in Israel. They still have some sort of money. However, at the point at which AU intervenes and takes the responsibility of what we would keep the peace, that is when foreign actors have further and further less incentive to actually help out these regions. So you have less investment from foreign actors who have more experience to be able to help out in what is happening in the African region. What is the alternative that we support? We support things like, root cutting off, things like block-in regions, things like sanctions, things like UN condemnation, things like public media exposing these kinds of narratives in order for you to stop the military coup d'etat that's happening. We don't support actual direct military intervention, or if we take them at the best case scenario, even things like sanctions. We also support, having more reliance on international bodies such as the US and UN, actually taking care of the scenario more than AU, because we think that they are inherently better actors. Firstly, because they have more expertise and more past experience on how to intervene and how to do it well. They have, secondly, more resources and money to be able to do so. But also, thirdly, because UN is able to, if they ever need more resources, if UN or US tries to fund AU and then thereby help the situation in Africa, that is a lot more indirect way of helping it, meaning you have a lot less oversight. We would rather prefer more having a direct form of, I guess, help and aid from these countries because they are able to then deliver what they know best. What is the interest of the AU? First of all, we want to note that AU is a relatively new organization, and before that, Africa was terribly divided by arbitrary lines, lots of ethnic conflict, huge informal economy, and instability that's happening. AU has uniquely born out of their idea and value on cooperation and sustainability, and this because they are a relatively new form of organization, having actual direct impact and development that is actually garnered upon, having an AU is very, very important in the sustainability of AU. Because if we form AU, but we lose a lot of money, or like individuals, nations who chip in money into the EU now see that money going to be used in some random small state that they don't really care about, nor do they benefit from. They don't necessarily see the fact that AU is actually catering to the values that they're actually aligned towards. Because it is a relatively new organization, they also have greater burden to be able to prove that AU is something that is worth staying in. Otherwise, people are likely going to not see it as a very valuable organization. Secondly, now moving on to my first argument, the AU's credibility as a regional peacekeeper depends on its adherence to non-violent conflict resolution. That is why principally, because these are states that have a lot of bloodshed, colonial fight that have embedded within their history, they don't want the very organization to now be able to further justify intervention. That is the exact thing that they don't like because they have histories of foreign intervention now causing even more further instability, meaning that AU's credibility and their value as an organization largely stands at the point in which they are principally non-violent in the ways they deal with conflict. That is how they appealed to these organizations to agree to join an AU in the first place. Secondly, let's move on to my practical arguments. Before that, I'll take POI from Seiji.
President Masisi of Botswana was intensely critical after no one intervened in Mnangagwa's COVID crackdowns in Zimbabwe in 2019. How do you appease Masisi as Zimbabwe's neighbor who did support violent intervention?
We tell you that at the point to which, like, I think, like, having more peaceful negotiations between individual states, if you are right nearby Zimbabwe, you actually doing intervening is far more better, where this is an actor motion and the actor is AU, not a neighboring country of Zimbabwe. If you're a neighboring country, you can do that. We're just saying that as the AU, we don't want to do it. Firstly, on practical consequences. Firstly, we think that this military intervention is not going to be effective. Firstly, we think that coup attempts are largely very much decentralized. There are things like guerrilla tactics, proxy wars supported by other countries like Russia and US. They're fighting in geographically isolated areas that are very, very difficult to protect. Even if you actually put in the money to fight against these organizations, it's likely decentralized, so the ability to actually, crack down on every kinds of coup d'etat is very, very unlikely and takes a lot of time, takes a lot of resources. Secondly, direct intervention is incredibly costly, not only in terms of resources, but the return on investment on the resources that you're putting into these countries is also very low. For example, in previous wars, like, for example, in the Cold War, a lot of the kind of wars were justified because it had an ideological spillover effect whereby communism was spreading. But for this, it's not like, political instability or the prevalence of political apathy that leads to the rise of authoritarian governments necessarily spreads, because a lot of the conditions and states to which each African nation is exposed to is incredibly different. So because of this, the return on investment, if we solve one country, is incredibly low to another country, so they have even less, justification for the use of their resources. Thirdly, AU does not have a very strong, like, the AU is likely going to combat against other organizations like the US, like Russia or China, that is backing these coup d'etat organizations. They're likely going to lose out on the funding that they have on that. But also, finally, the root causes of these, coup d'etats are likely things like internal instability. Preventing, like, fightings that are happening in the physical land might be able to stop, like, one coup d'etat, but you won't be able to solve future coup d'etats unless you solve the root cause of these problems, which are social political instability. We tell you, if AU is able to cooperate better, negotiate better, trade negotiations, develop the country overall, have better things like political and educational systems, that is what's going to largely solve the kinds of instability that we see in the regions. So AU might have the funding to be able to stop one coup d'etat, but not 2, 3, 4, but now they are pressured to do so because they have taken on that role. Two other negative consequences that come of this. Firstly, we think this is going to cause internal splintering because not everyone would agree or nor think that this was actually worth the money, meaning that we see even less cooperation. But I told you that AU's primary interest in the starting of their organization, in the sustainability of their organization, is the fact that they're able to cooperate to actually produce good outcomes. But if they cannot cooperate on the usage of this money in the first place, this is likely going to cause splintering. Also, secondly, Africa has also, like, interest to invite a lot of foreign investors. If you are intervening in other people's countries, that creates further instability that blocks out FDI from other countries, meaning that the development of AU's economy is also further deterred.
Starting in 3, 2. OG ultimately says two things. One, that the coup regime is likely to be worse than the current government, and therefore bringing back the shell government that already somehow failed is most likely going to be a better alternative. Second, they posit that the coup regime has to necessarily be attacked and be necessarily fought by the AU instead of other specific nations, because one, other nations won't fight back, and second, the AU somehow is capable of doing this because of historical precedents. Two things I'm going to argue. First, why the coup regime is likely to be better, if not just significantly better than the shell government that has already failed and likely back into power. Their argument for this is, there are military dictatorships, so the assumption is that all military dictatorships are going to be bad. The second, the simple argument here is that the military dictatorship probably doesn't want to fall into the same reasons and the same tactics as why the previous government lost power in the first place and why the coup happened in the first place. That in itself is probably an incentive enough for the military coup to at least cater towards a certain kind of economic developments that is not likely to cause a future coup or likely cause massive amount of destabilization for their own citizens, so their own citizens either die out and simply their nation falls as a consequence, or their citizens actively revolt, or the other, or like institutions or like the UN does not actively intervene because of the massive atrocities that they're committing. But secondly, I think it's simply easier, cheaper, and faster to work with a new coup government than to work with a failing nation that has already bleeding out resources and ultimately led to this coup happening in the first place. Two reasons to support why this is likely true. One, the reason this happened in the first place is probably because of the weak democracy and the hugely unstable political parties that are likely to have power in the first place. This generally means that the nation in itself already has weakened institutions and weakened kind of like legislative changes or like systematic structures to make a nation being propped out in the first place. This likely means that the coup d'etat or the military dictatorship is more likely going to be at least having having sort of idea of what to do and what not to do insofar as creating an efficient government based on historical precedents. But now, even if this is not true and the military coup is insanely bad, why this is just going to be worse if you actually fight them? I think Clara already did a great enough job talking about why intervention in itself escalates this into hugely costly wars and hugely kind of impacts all other nearby nations, making the economic development like a lot worse, right? But here's additionally why the coup situations are not going to be just worth it, right? As the AU, most likely the question you're asking is this going to be possible for me to stop? And the question here is other nations going to support me or not? Because insofar as other nations do not support you in like fighting this war, most likely AU alone is not likely to like sustainably fight this, simply because of the fact that most likely this AU already severely lacks development, because the development has to be necessarily used to keep their own nations in check, because their own nations are also developing nations that generally needs these resources to survive in the first place. Now, coup situations cannot be held up. Why is this true? 3 reasons. One, at best, even when you can prevent one coup, most likely the instability that is caused and the direct opportunity cost that is used, like a lot of these development aid that is used, a lot of the military personnel that is used, is going to be directly at the cost of other nations being unstable. This most likely means for other nations the coup is most likely going to happen, or internal conflict, whether it be civil war, a detachment, or things are much just as likely to happen worse off in their side. But second, most likely the instability of constant aid be giving to these nations, specific each nations, most likely means that the economic downturn as a whole African continent is going to be much worse on their side, unless they provide a reason as to why both economic development and like fighting this war could happen. Now, 3, their idea is that essentially sanctions could also be successful. Most likely these sanctions, sure, might benefit in that, it might reduce the effectiveness of this coup, reduce the effectiveness of this new government, but that does not, one, guarantee a reason as to why those nations cannot out-survive insofar as other nations, like other proxy nations that necessarily have a, incentive to support this war would like constantly support them. But secondly, this also generally does not engage with the idea that most likely these nations, even if they fall, would still likely lead to the same amount of economic devastations that both sides are trying to prevent in the first place. Now, even if the coup is stopped, why is this likely true? Why is this likely bad? 5 reasons. So 1, should states and institutions that were devastated by the war worse off, are just generally worse off because of these interventions, whether that be sanctions that makes this institution severely lack funding and severely lack politicians who are able to prop up this economy, prop up this place later on, or second, because of a lot of the leaders are either fleeing to other nations, or a lot of these leaders have been shot or killed, or a lot of the reasons leaders simply have to become more radical insofar as they have to try to prevent more coups happening later on. But second, the public distrust and the questionable legitimacy of the new power or like the previous power is going to simply lead to more unstable democracies insofar as they had been couped and they're back now, but somehow we just assume that they're going to be back and stronger. That's most likely not going to be the case, and the citizens are probably going to be just as angry as before. Third, the internal political divisions, both inside the AU as in the member states, not agreeing to this war, simply because even if it's a 51%, that simply means 49% did not agree for this, definitely meaning that there's going to be trade-off and there's going to be like lack of compromises that is causing more inefficiencies inside the AU to run effectively in the first place, but also because the internal conflict within the nation is likely to simply mean that politicians generally have to be more radical in a hopes for like gathering power so that they can at least convince the citizens that we're not going to do the same mistakes, or we're not going to do the same kind of problems as before. But 4, even if they're able to be saved, the most likely we're still going to be hugely dependent on foreign aid and foreign support. This foreign support being from the AU. This directly means that the AU now has to constantly be bled out, and in order to save this one nation that was failing in the first place, not providing a reason as to how this nation is going to survive later on, unless magic, right? 5th, why worst economic disruption is going to happen. I think just simply military dictatorship probably military coup probably means the military is strong enough to cause a coup in the first place, meaning that they're not just gonna back down. Probably means that wars are going to happen or devastation is still going to occur. Prolonging this simply means the impact of whatever we just said, the harm of whatever we just said, are just going to amplify insofar as you don't resolve this in the quickest way possible. But note how the lack of diplomatic actions that are likely to happen because of simply you don't want to have this precedence of making the coup government actually legitimized in the first place, as the previous speaker said, is most likely going to be the lead cause of why more wars are going to be fought and more interventions are going to happen, causing more instability in the first place. Now, the alternative is like the UN, ECOWAS, and other maybe individual neighbor states that are trying to nearby states that try to prevent this coup from happening. Why are they not likely to be? Why are they likely to be enough? One is to simply say that they can gain more support gradually as they simply build up trust or whatever, right? Most likely, it also like questions why necessarily on their side these alternatives does not happen. Insofar as the UN, again, if it's a 51%, even like as CEO has mentioned, right? Most likely it is enough of an atrocity for other nations to intervene severely. But secondly, I would posit that nations like China or nations like China or involved with China that are like that heavily depend or really are interested on the BRICS and One Belt One Road initiative probably has a huge interest to help or at least fight against the military coup if it's really that detrimental. Then the question is, if it's not detrimental, why would they attack in the first place? Probably they won't. Then it's simply a waste of resource. Now, if they are going to, if China and BRICS is China and other nations like BRICS or like the UN simply would intervene to make sure that these kind of devastations does not happen. Why is it likely going to be like? Why does it necessarily have to be the burden of AU to provide this kind of solvency? That is ultimately the question. Thank you.
Thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. Now we begin the back half debate, introducing the Member of Government.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Luigi, he, him, they. If you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat. I'll watch the chat for all of your POIs. That should be good. If the AU does not intervene, then regional superpowers like Rwanda, Nigeria, and the DRC will. This is the most important consideration in this debate because it is going to be explained to be the most salient and most important risk, and also furthermore, the precondition for economic and political cooperation in the AU is the ability to coordinate your military security policy. OG merely assumes that they must help the opposition and that the AU can collaborate between countries, but they don't explain how this leads to stability, and nor do they explain why it is realistic that they will actually get a democracy. Opening opposition, on the other hand, says that they should help the new military government, but they don't explain why many countries in the AU will necessarily agree to it. Closing Gov will give the most realistic and clearest impact in the round. 2 arguments. Number 1, why this reduces inter-regional military conflict, and number 2, why coordinated AU interventions are more long-term lasting. Let's go on to the arguments, response between and after. First, reduces inter-regional military conflict. There will always be many authoritarian governments on either side, and perfect democracy is unlikely on either side because of the imperfections of government and capital investment. So, the most important mechanism in this debate is the cooperation in Africa to coordinate military security, to address the risks of rebel group militias, terrorist groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria, and to stabilize trading routes across borders. If we can demonstrate that domestic coups directly disenfranchise this because they become more violent, they often spill over into more borders and cause more refugee crises into other nations, prompting other nations to intervene on their own, as the DLO conceded in their speech, then we win the debate. I want to explain why this is important. Opening Gov is just dependent on cooperation with the opposition party, but they don't explain why that's the only mechanism, right? It's not guaranteed always in the time as a function of military intervention from the AU. We say military cooperation between states in the AU is the most important mechanism that you must highlight here. So, domestic coups have historically led to regional conflicts for the following reasons. 4 reasons. Number 1, because of external parties that would take advantage of the power vacuum that is created by a coup, for example, like terrorist groups and rebel militias in the DRC. Number 2, because neighboring countries want to prevent a refugee crisis from spilling over onto their land. Number 3, because neighboring military leaders want to prevent a coup on their own soil by encouraging coup d'etats from their own military leaders. And lastly, because dictators want to preserve the trade relative with these leaders that are at risk of losing power because of relatively new militaries and the military administration being more uncertain. So this is why Paul Kagame has historically always sent the Rwandan military to engage with the coups that have always been happening in Zimbabwe, for example, to protect Robert Mugabe, because that's his buddy, that's his friend, which has led to more regional instability in the long run. So we say for all of these reasons, this is a more approximate harm, more approximate risk. It is harder for you to get them to cooperate unless you have the AU intervene collaboratively in a multilateral manner. Why does preemptive AU military intervention resolve this collective action problem? 2 specific mechanisms that I will build here. Number 1, the AU has a mutual incentive from different regional superpowers to contribute regional peacekeeping forces, facilitate the regional transfer of the UN and Red Cross operation across borders. Like, for example, what is this that I have over here? Like, for example, the UN Organization Stabilization Mission in the DRC, they have military capacity from there, and so it is easier for you to collaborate from the specializations of militaries from different regions when you contribute those resources as opposed to just relying on conscription from one particular neighboring nation. And so, for example, it makes militaries more diverse, more accountable, equitable, and also more humane in allowing for the transfer of different inter-regional peacekeeping forces or, human rights organizations that are already involved for different reasons across different areas to be able to mutually enter into these borders, without the threat of a military intervention and the sovereignty being violated of a particular country. Number two, the AU is able to facilitate military security to defend against the coup being vulnerable to continued infighting with other militias and terrorist groups as a consequence of the fact that they also don't want those terrorist groups to grow into their own regions as well. So it is significantly a very mutual incentive that people will opt in because a coup creating that instability magnifies the power that these individuals have. That's why ECOWAS was successful, because it wasn't Nigeria biased from the Nigerian military. It was multilateral because it included Nigeria and Algeria and Ghana with the ability for them to intervene in the Ivory Coast and also prevent the spillover of conflict into their own nations, because it's not only going to be protecting the Nigerian military, it protects every single nation because you create collaborative security arrangements and the consequence, like for example, creating military bases, military security borders, making sure that it doesn't go into these areas as well as a consequence of that coup d'etat spilling over to these places. So this is a long-term process. That is why we go on to the second argument. Why then do we believe this is important? Coups or any smaller multinational or intervention create strong long-term uncertainty of governments. It's difficult to generate popular will. It's very difficult to undermine the democratic process, and the technocracy of this government, new coup, for example, will not be able to distribute welfare meaningfully to these nations. That's why AU trade is necessary. Opening government only talks about deterrence, but they forget that and they misunderstand the actual long-term implications of AU being a mediating facilitator in this conflict. That's why the AU facilitating this through long-term, like military involvement, cooperation, post-intervention is very important in two key ways. Number one, you have the construction of coordinated ready forces that are employed under the African Union that are military affiliated members. The creation of these bases and security cooperatives between different nations to prevent further conflict in the future. So it's very, very easy to deploy. Number two, even if we preserve existing dictatorships, which is our worst case at opening gov, that they did not respond to from opening up, we change the militaries and the composition of such because there's an incentive for those leaders to try and change them to be a pro-AU military force that will eventually be sent over to other countries if it is needed. So again, even if it is self-interested, even if there are dictatorships, we promote economic stability and political stability between these nations, and that is why it is good. Opening up, go ahead before I respond.
I understand that collaboration might have made good impact, but the problem is that AU doesn't agree to collaborate in the first place because the money that you bleed into intervention creates an opportunity cost of AU's money that they can use to for economic development or agricultural subsidies or other things that AU prioritizes.
No, so our argument was that the risk of a coup d'etat is in one country spilling over into further conflict and regional intervention into other areas is a bigger cost that many of these leaders and citizens do know is much worse than the cost of sending their own military soldiers and their own regional forces and allowing people to move between borders, sending the Red Cross from region to region is much a better trade-off that they're willing to accept. That's our argument. That's why it works. So let's respond to opening up and just show how our argument wins. Number one, they said that we should cooperate with the new government. Other states will disagree with this more as a consequence of the fact that those military generals threaten the sovereignty of other nations. Number two, opening up says that civil conflict is going to be worse and that there will be more intervention in the consequence. We've given you reasons why civil conflict is much worse on their side as a consequence of the domestic coup that is more centralized in their model, and that the AU is the best stabilizing military force. And lastly, when they say that we create dependence on the AU, we think dependence is good. Economic interdependence facilitated by the AU allows for long-term cooperation through military security agreements. That is why we win. So for these reasons, because we explained to you the most salient, guaranteed impact, we win from closing up.
Closing opposition would make three major contributions. First of all, why even if coups can eventually be stopped on proposition, why the conflict and the violation and violence that escalates on prop is significantly worse. Secondly, I'm going to explain why the comparative in our side of the house positively is better off. Finally, I'm going to explain why this results in the loss of AU support on an international stage. First things first. Even if you can eventually stop the coup, I'm going to explain why the violence simply escalates in the opposition world. This is for two simple mechanisms. First of all, because I think AU cannot simply just destroy the coups, because coups simply know more about the location. It is about the hidden drones and bombs within that specific area. It is about the geographical landscape that exists in it. To illustrate, just think about how France, for instance, has suffered from dealing with the terrorist groups that exist in Niger, insofar as the terrorist groups simply knew much more about the location and about the simple geographical landscape that exists in it. But secondly, I want to point out that the proxy warfare exists. OG says, well, but China and Russia is already invested in Ukraine and Israel, and therefore it is unlikely that they will intervene. This is not true for two reasons. Firstly, because I think you can simply do both, right? They never proved to you why the resources are simply significantly lacking to the point where you simply want to lose all of the soft power that exists in Africa. But secondly, we'll flip this. That is the precise reason why you need African countries in the status quo. You need the soft power within the Africa. You need those countries to politically align to them, to actually send them weapons, for instance, to actually support them in the United Nations, for instance. So to illustrate, when France left Niger and is currently leaving Western Africa right now, it is Wagner Group that is significantly increasing its prevalence since 2021, which has meant that I think our argument is empirically true as well. Here's how we weigh this. First of all, I want to note that people on the ground simply do not care about the government in the first place on who is in the power of the government or support the government in the first place. What they do care is about the violence that exists in it. And I want to, secondly, flip simply OG's mechanism and how you care about the brutality that exists in the coups and you care about the stability within the region. But if the mechanisms by which we solve the brutality is by actually creating more brutality, by involving a lot of wars to begin with, I think it's simply non-existent. I think it's just simply worse on their side of the house. Before I move on to the second extension, I'll take a POI from OG.
Yep, as we explained, the AU forces with South Africa, with higher technology, with much more financial power, is able to smoothly sweep the coup d'etat regime. So it's just not going to be the chaotic, violent, brutal situation that you describe.
It's unclear to me why they would want to sweep out the power when we tell you about how, one, these coups have power to begin with, but secondly, Russia and China has a continued incentive to actually fund the military groups in opposition power. Like, for instance, let's say that the US is currently supporting its current government. China has the incentive to support the opposition party, number one, because I think it would weaken the US. But number two, I would argue that I think it's just like, I think that China would want more power to begin with. But I would also know that there's way too many coups to begin with, which has meant that the AU has not much of a resources to begin with. But even if you don't credit all of them, I'm going to explain why the comparative in our side of the house is better. I want to note that the OG's case suffers from its own framing. PM gives you two reasons as to why countries do not opt out. Presumably that is another reason why coups will listen to AU's demand on our side of the house as well. Because note that on opposition, what we support is not inaction. What we support is a passive way of solving the problem. This looks like not granting membership. This looks like demanding and urging those coups to become more democratic. So as OG said, because they want economic benefit and development aid, I think coups will simply cannot remain as its own state. And I know OG says, we would only do it if it doesn't work in the status quo, right? I want to deal with this in a few ways. Firstly, I think their case is premised upon countries being able to rationally assess whether it works or not. They simply cannot, right? Because they simply are probably irrationally going to support this insofar as they want to stop this conflict and they want to incent and things like that. But secondly, I would argue that OG never explains why this will be a voting process, right? I.e., I think countries like Nigeria or countries like South Africa or Ethiopia, which has a significant amount of resources even within the AU, has meant that I think there are existence of countries that has significant power which can, I think, pressurize other countries to actually vote in their certain way. But third of all, I think a lot of the countries have an incentive to actually do this and military intervene insofar as they directly benefit from it. I.e., they want to dissuade the coups from happening because the current government, especially in the context of Africa, where there are a lot of coups to begin with, I think in these kind of contexts, government has the incentive to dissuade the future coups insofar as I think that would also diminish the probability of that government actually being overthrown by the other coups in their own region, which has meant that when AU actually does intervene, that creates a signaling effect where coups will be dissuaded, which means that I think the decision-making process of that AU going into a military action is significantly fast. Why is it that those coups are going to listen on our side of the house? I think that reason for that is simple. One, because I think there's interest of its people, i.e. the concept of things like authoritarian minimum, where I think insofar as precisely because this is a context where coups can happen, I think the coups have an incentive to actually become democratic in the future. And this is the exact reason why I think in Niger, coups have said to the AU that they will transition into a democratic government a few years down the line. But secondly, I think even when they actually turn democratic, they can still be in power because, like, let's say, like, they never prove why coups don't have popularity to begin with. In Niger, let's say like 70% of the individuals already support the coup. Even if you don't buy that, I think our first mechanism still stands. Moving on to my last last extension as to why you are likely to lose the AU support on an international level on propositions world. There's simply two mechanisms. The first thing I want to point out is that I think there exists proxy warfare, as I have told you, which has meant that I think China, Russia, and US is likely to aid a specific like side on the other. But the second thing I want to point out is that I think there exists an incentive within the international sphere of an average country. It's not within like AU, but it's also external to a lot of the regions in the world that they don't want to anger US and China to begin with, or a lot of the countries involved in it, which has meant that when you actually support the AU, that is likely to support a lot of the actions taken by the AU and support a lot of the military action taken by it. So the weighing here is that insofar as you are likely to lose AU support on their side of the house, there's likely to be like a diminishment of a lot of the things that AU can do on an international stage. Like for instance, I think this would likely result in AU not being able to get popularity within the UNSC reform, where we've seen 2 out of 5 P5 countries supporting AU's like way of actually creating change, which has meant that on their side, you are likely to lose a lot of diplomatic power, which means that AU externally will lose power. For all of those 3 contributions, Theo takes this debate.
For the opposition or existing powers in the country. This means that even though it is true that, for example, collaboration with militaries or increased military power is possible, the existing government also likely has ties with other governments that allow them for increased power. This means this alone is not an independent reason why the AU is able to topple governments. Secondly, as OO and CO repeatedly point out, the number of coups that occur in the African region is incredibly extreme. There are 40 plus coups every single year. The implication being that even if OG is able to put out some fires in some areas, they're incapable in proving to you that they're able to do this in the majority of areas. This will kick in a little bit later. On OO argumentation, OO poses to you 4 reasons why military intervention is unlikely to be effective. In the OG's rush, they failed to engage to a few of this, and I want to note a couple of them. Firstly, in this idea that AU combats against other organizations, Firstly, this idea that physical fights and solving these physical fights by military intervention is never able to solve the root causes of the problem. This has no engagement from OG. This is important because it's probably not a black or white decision here, whether or not you are able to solve coups. Some coups will be solved by the AU, the others likely won't. I think OO and CO is able to post you adequate reasons why it's unlikely in at the very least some, if not most instances, that the AU is likely to successfully intervene. Why then is therefore these few instances most important? 2 reasons. 1, on the opportunity cost, because AU resources are to some extent zero-sum. When you spend money on military, you're unable to spend it on other things. All of the various reasons why people want to remain in the AU that OG mentions are the things that the AU is now unable to invest in, which means AU also loses its power. This is a massive opportunity cost. Things like subsidization, FDIs, all of that decreases. Secondly, not all solvencies are created equal. This means even if some solvency is achievable from OG or from AU in general, it's unclear why these solvencies are inherently good. Opposition poses to you 2 reasons why it's not good. 1, because the government that likely takes over is not that good. OO sufficiently proves this to you from their deputy. And secondly, that the root cause solvency never actually occurs, which means conflict is likely to arise. I know Seiji engages to this. I'll talk about Seiji next. On CG then, the CG claim is basically to say that regional conflict, it's more likely that regional conflict occurs in our world. I firstly want to deal with this idea. The problem with this idea is that this assumes that the AU is able to intervene in such regional conflicts, or in such coups that eventually result in regional conflicts in our world. 2 reasons why this is unlikely. 1, because these regional conflicts just tend to be smaller in nature, especially at their beginning, which means AU has resource diversion into more larger conflicts. And secondly, because only the surrounding regions of that one country in a coup actually care, this never reached the 51% that OG sets out. The second CG case brings to you this idea on long-term security, and they post you 2 reasons why they're better able to protect it long-term. There are 2 problems with this case. Number 1, because government never has this fiat to assume long-term existence post-coup solvency, it's unclear why this will happen. On the flip, we think it's more likely that the AU has to pull out because they have to constantly put out fires in other areas per their framing. Secondly, note once again, that this is massively resource intensive. Maintaining long-term security in one region comes at the cost of other regions, and they never prove why this is possible in all regions. Finally, I want to note that CG actually never properly weighs this, so I want to talk about how OG successfully does the weighing for CG. OG, from Deputy, says this idea that, some coups saved is better than no coups saved. The problem is, saving a few coups means worsening a bunch of other coups, which is where our extending argumentations kick in. We post you two extensions. First, the stronger extension. This is this idea that AU nations opt in immaturely, and there are a few reasons why this is true. One, because the rich countries have disproportionate power in the AU, and these are the countries with the least amount of trade-off on resources, which means they're more likely to support intervention. And secondly, because current governments don't want to dissuade future coups because that would diminish the possibility of them being overthrown in the future. This means that they can't co-opt this "we'll do it gradually" idea. In the comparative, we proved to you that coups will transition more likely to the democratic government than not in our world because of the two reasons from member speech that we give you as to why the country because of government's two mechanisms as to why the countries need AU. Further, we also push two things from the member of Gov. First, in regards to the interest of the people in terms of authoritarian minimums, and secondly, because they can still be in power. Look at, for example, Niger, where the coup had 70% citizen support. The conclusion of this extension was to say that this is the most effective way to solve coups because coups happen. This is the most effective way because coups happen all the time, and in most of these instances, it's likely that democratic transition is possible. I don't think Seiji extension actually directly engages to this idea. Then, we post you another extension in saying that even if this democratic transition never actually successfully manifests, that violence escalation in general decreases in all of these coups. There are a couple reasons why violence escalates in their world. All of the reasons are similar to OO in terms of saying that because there are varying reasons why the existing government is also likely to put up quite a good fight and the opposition or the new coup is also likely to put up a good fight, and this likely manifests in a worse way when the AU intervenes with their knowledge, with their military capacity, and with their people. The impact of this was fairly, and we also further added mechanization here. And for example, talking about the knowledge of the area that only the people have. And OG literally makes this case for us when explaining the reasons why international support is unlikely, that international institutions don't know the situation on the ground. Then we also add why international support on opposition is more likely than not. One, because there was zero mechanization from Gov in terms of why this was unlikely on an actual practical basis. Secondly, because Africa is somewhat important for these people. And thirdly, also I would note that all of the mechanization you get from OG in regards to the 51% sufficiently proves to us that when AU has to intervene, it's also likely that this has massive detrimental impacts on the international community, and therefore the international community also has incentive to intervene. The CZ response comes in the form of saying coups likely don't work. This is, even if we were to concede to all of these argumentations, and even if we were to lose on the ground of getting democratic change, AU intervention uniquely gets rid of these issues. AU intervention gets rid of these issues like decentralization or bad equipment, and getting rid of these issues is exactly the reason why conflict likely gets worse. When we solve these issues for the people on the ground, when we make fighting easier, when we make fighting worse, when we make fighting more extreme, that is at the point in which conflict gets exacerbated, and that is at the point in which people die. So, even if we were to take all of government's argumentations, they're only able to prove to you that in some instances, coups get solved. What OO and also CO uniquely proves to you is this idea that in the vast majority of these coups, it's likely that conflict either gets worse or just never gets solved on proposition. CO.
Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a nice nap. I'm sure it's 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock for some of us. So, please go take a nap. You'll get your results. You know when you get your results. Thank you and have a great night.